With a gun in her hand, Amanda screamed that I had threatened her in front of the entire family. The words slammed through the dining room louder than the fire crackling in the corner. Her arm trembled as she pointed at me, her voice breaking into hysterics, and every head at the Thanksgiving table turned toward me with horror. My stomach lurched as the fork slipped from my hand, clattering onto the plate like a gavel sealing my fate. Clara tried to scare me. Amanda cried, tears spilling down her cheeks in perfect performance. She aimed this at me. I thought she would shoot. The gun glinted under the chandelier, heavy with accusation. I opened my mouth, but Mark, her husband, and my brother-in-law shot up from his chair so fast it toppled backward. He grabbed Amanda as though he were shielding her from a wild animal, and his eyes locked on me with rage. "Stay where you are, Clara," he barked. "You've gone too far." The words scorched me. Gloria. My mother-in-law clutched her pearls and let out a gasp that might have been rehearsed 100 times in her head. "Dear God, I knew it. I knew this would happen," she cried, her face twisting with theatrical despair. Across the table, Daniel, my husband of 6 years, stared into his plate as though the mashed potatoes might hold the answer. He would not look up. He would not look at me. His silence cut deeper than any accusation. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. The air smelled of roasted turkey and betrayal thick with gravy and judgment. Amanda sobbed harder, pressing the gun against her chest, as if she had rescued the family from a predator. "She hates me," she whimpered. "She has always hated me. Tonight I thought she was going to end it." My body shook as I slammed my hands on the table. "That is a lie. I never touched that gun." My voice cracked, but it was too late. The eyes around me had already chosen a side, and it was not mine. The children went quiet, their forks frozen mid-air as though they were witnessing a monster rise at the head of the table. Mark shoved his chair forward like a barricade, sneering at me. "Sit down, Clara. Do not make this any worse." Worse! As if I had already been condemned. Gloria leaned forward, her coral lipstick smearing against the rim of her wineglass. "I told Daniel you were unstable," she hissed. "Now everyone can see I was right." I turned to Daniel, desperate pleading. Tell them this is insane. You know me." Finally, he lifted his eyes, and for one aching moment, I thought he would defend me. But his voice came out flat, weary, stripped of loyalty. "Clara, please, just calm down." The betrayal in those words hollowed me out. My husband had abandoned me with one sigh, one surrender. Amanda lowered the gun onto the table with exaggerated care, as though she had just disarmed a criminal. Her eyes flicked up, locking on mine with victorious malice hidden behind wet lashes. "Look at her," she whispered hoarsely. "She cannot even deny it. She is dangerous. She wanted me gone." My throat burned. My chest squeezed until I could hardly breathe. "You are lying!" I shouted, my voice raw. "You all know she is lying!" But the silence that followed told me everything. They did not know. They did not care. They believed her. The chandelier above seemed to shake under the weight of tension. The holiday that should have been about gratitude had transformed into my public execution. Amanda's crocodile tears streamed down, and she clung to Mark as if she were the victim of a nightmare. Gloria whispered to herself like a prayer, "I warned them. I warned them." Daniel lowered his head again, a coward who had once promised to love and protect me. My world tilted on its axis. I realized in that moment that I was no longer a wife or a daughter-in-law. I was the accused, the condemned, the villain of a story I had not written. The gun sat on the table between us, but it was not the weapon. Amanda's lie was the weapon, and it had already pierced through my life, leaving me bleeding in front of the entire family. The silence after her sobs was deafening, sealing my fate. I knew with certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. My name is Clara Mitchell, and if you had asked me before that disastrous Thanksgiving who I would have said I was a 32-year-old nurse, a woman who worked long shifts at the hospital in Boston, someone who tried her best to be kind, steady, and reliable. I would have told you I was married to Daniel Mitchell, a man. I thought I could build a life with a man I believed would stand beside me when storms came. For 6 years of marriage, I had convinced myself that even though we had not been blessed with children, and even though we carried scars from a miscarriage, I still struggled to talk about we were a unit. I thought that the absence of children did not erase the presence of love. I thought that working 12-hour shifts and holding lives in my hands every day was something to be proud of. Even if my family-in-law constantly reminded me that my womb had not delivered them an heir. Daniel and I had lived in a small apartment close to the hospital. Our lives were simple. I would come home exhausted, collapse onto the couch, and he would order Chinese food. We would watch documentaries, sometimes argue over which one to choose, and I felt safe enough to think this was stability. Yet beneath that surface, cracks had always been there, spreading silently like fractures in glass. Those cracks had names. One was Amanda, my sister-in-law, whose perfect smile always masked her sharpened teeth. She had married Mark Daniel's older brother, and from the beginning she measured herself against me. Amanda had 2 children quickly, and every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday party she paraded them around like medals. She looked at me like I was defective, as though my body's struggles were character flaws. Another crack was Gloria, my mother-in-law, who wore control like a crown. She had never forgiven me for not bending to her expectations, for keeping my career rather than dropping everything to be a housewife. She would call Daniel in the mornings to remind him that he needed a woman who could build him a legacy, not a nurse who spent her nights saving strangers. Daniel would nod, and though he did not repeat her words to me, the silence between us carried their weight. And of course there was Mark, always loud, always certain that his authority was unquestionable. He reminded me every family gathering that he was the eldest, that he carried responsibility, and that his wife had given him children without complaint. He smirked at me across tables, his pride inflating Amanda's contempt. Through all of this, I kept my head high. I thought if I worked harder, loved Daniel more fiercely, kept giving even when no one gave back, they would one day see my worth. I thought I could prove myself by sheer persistence. I ignored Amanda's whispers, Gloria's sighs, Mark's smirks. I told myself Daniel loved me, and that was enough. But love should not be silent when knives are at your back. Love should not turn away when lies are spoken aloud. In the weeks leading up to that Thanksgiving, I remember working double shifts at the hospital, catching only a few hours of sleep, telling myself that fatigue was temporary and family dinners were worth the trouble. Daniel had been distracted quieter than usual, and when I asked if something was wrong, he only shrugged. He said the family wanted this holiday to be peaceful, that maybe it could be a chance to start fresh. I believed him. I believed in chances. I ironed my dress, baked a pie, and told myself to smile no matter what Amanda said, no matter what Gloria whispered. I walked into that house determined to hold myself with grace. I had no idea that Amanda had already planned my downfall. I had no idea that my husband's silence would cut me deeper than any blade. I had no idea that my role in their family drama had already been written and that I was cast as the villain. When Amanda raised that gun and screamed my name, every unspoken insult, every sigh, every sideways glance from the years before exploded into open hostility. They had been waiting for the moment to confirm their suspicions, to prove I was never enough. That was who I was before the gun appeared. Clara Mitchell, nurse, wife, woman who believed love and patience could outlast cruelty. Woman who was about to discover how wrong she had been. If my life had been a play, then Amanda was the actress who stole the stage long before I realized she was auditioning. She was 35, polished to perfection, always ready with a laugh that sounded like bells but never reached her eyes. She had a way of placing her hand on someone's shoulder that made them feel adored, while her gaze simultaneously stripped them down. From the moment I joined the Mitchell family, she studied me, searching for cracks, cataloging my insecurities, and she knew exactly where to press. Amanda thrived on performance. She presented herself as the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect addition to the Mitchell name. She threw birthday parties with color-coordinated decorations, cooked dinners that looked like they belonged in magazines, and knew precisely how to drop subtle comments about her fertility and homemaking in front of me. Whenever Gloria, my mother-in-law, praised her, Amanda's eyes would flick toward me, glinting with triumph. Gloria herself was 60, elegant in appearance, but sharp as a blade in words. She wore long pearl necklaces and carried herself as though the family's reputation was her personal empire. To her, control was love. She did not simply want her children to be happy, she wanted them to live the lives she designed. She viewed me as an obstacle from the very beginning. I was not raised in the same social circle. I had ambitions of my own, and worst of all, I could not provide her with grandchildren to parade at Sunday church. She masked her contempt with sighs, with questions about when Daniel and I would finally start a family, with backhanded compliments about my dedication to my job. But the mask never fooled me. Gloria believed obedience was virtue and independence was rebellion. Her son's wife was supposed to bend, not stand tall. Then there was Mark, Daniel's older brother, who at 37 carried himself like the second head of the household. He was broad-shouldered, loud, and certain of his authority. His opinions filled every room. He treated Amanda like a queen, but his respect for women ended there. To him, I was weak because I did not produce children, defiant because I refused to lower my eyes when he spoke, and foolish because I dared to confront Amanda's passive aggression with calm refusal. Mark delighted in cornering me at family gatherings with jokes about how my hospital job was just busy work, nothing compared to raising kids. Each word was intended to slice, to remind me of where I failed in his hierarchy. He laughed loudest when Amanda mocked me, reinforcing the alliance of husband and wife against me. And then there was Daniel, my husband, who, though not the architect of cruelty, was its silent sponsor. Daniel had never raised his voice against me, never struck me, never called me names. But his silence was worse in its way because it gave permission. He let Amanda's remarks slide. He let Gloria's criticism sink in. He let Mark's arrogance dominate the room. He believed keeping the peace was more important than defending me. He told me that arguing back would only make things worse. His quietness was not neutrality, it was surrender, and each time he failed to speak, I felt more alone. Together they formed a wall, a family fortress with me on the outside. Amanda played the victim, Gloria, the general, Mark the enforcer, and Daniel the bystander. Their combined roles meant that no matter what I did, I was painted as the problem. If I smiled through Amanda's barbs, they called me cold. If I answered Gloria's questions firmly, they called me rude. If I stood up to Mark's arrogance, they called me hysterical. The narrative was written, and each of them contributed lines. By the time that Thanksgiving dinner arrived, Amanda knew she could frame me with a gun, and the family would nod in agreement. Gloria's control set the stage. Mark's dominance added pressure. Daniel's silence cleared the path, and Amanda's cunning provided the spark. To them, it was easy to believe I could snap because they had spent years telling each other that was who I really was. The family was toxic not because of one act, but because of the steady drip of poison year after year. And when Amanda raised her voice and declared I had threatened her, they were ready to drink that poison openly. The antagonists were not strangers or distant enemies. They were the people who had shared meals with me, exchanged gifts, posed for photos. That was what made their betrayal all the more lethal. The moment Amanda raised her trembling hand and cried that I had pointed the gun at her, the air inside the dining room thickened into suffocating silence. It was not the silence of shock, but the silence of judgment, a silence that told me decisions had already been made. Mark slammed his chair backward and positioned himself like a barrier between me and Amanda, his jaw set, his voice booming as he barked at me to stay away. Gloria clutched the edge of the table, whispering that she had always known I was unstable, her eyes gleaming with a strange satisfaction as though my downfall was a prophecy she had been waiting to see fulfilled. Daniel still would not look at me. He stared at the turkey carcass, his fork twisting absent-mindedly into the stuffing as though burying himself in silence would erase the truth. I opened my mouth to protest, to shout that the accusation was madness, but Amanda was already crying harder, shaking so violently she almost dropped the weapon onto the polished wood. She pressed her body into Mark's chest, clutching his arm like he was her savior, sobbing that she had feared for her life. I could see the calculation in her eyes beneath the tears. This was a performance written long before tonight, rehearsed in her mind until every whimper sounded authentic. The gun had been hidden somewhere in the dining room, perhaps slipped into the drawer of the sideboard, perhaps planted under a cushion, waiting for the moment when she could unveil it as evidence against me. She had chosen this night with precision because the family was gathered, because witnesses were present, because my humiliation would be public and therefore permanent. The clink of silverware ceased. Even the children fell silent. My voice cracked as I shouted that I had never touched the gun, that Amanda was lying, that this was a setup, but the more desperately I spoke, the more unhinged I must have looked to them. Amanda clung to Mark, hiccuping, whispering that she had only wanted peace, that she had tried to make the holiday joyful, and now she feared for the safety of her children. At that word, Gloria gasped again, rushing to Amanda's side, muttering that no woman who denied her family children could ever understand the instinct to protect them. Her words sliced into me, tearing open old wounds, reminding me of my miscarriage, reminding me of every cruel remark about my body's betrayal. My cheeks burned, my chest tightened, and my throat swelled with the urge to scream. But before I could speak again, the doorbell rang. For a moment, there was confusion, but then Mark announced that the police had already been called. My stomach dropped. Amanda had thought of everything. Within minutes, 2 officers entered the room, their eyes darting between the hysterical woman with the gun and the silent family glaring at me. Amanda handed over the weapon with trembling hands, insisting she had wrestled it away from me in a moment of terror. Her voice cracked at just the right moments, her tears glistened under the light, and the officers nodded slowly. They turned to me, asking me to explain myself, but my words sounded weak even to my own ears. I insisted I had never touched the gun, that Amanda was framing me, but every face around the table except the children screamed disbelief. Mark shouted that he had seen me lunge. Gloria wailed that she had feared this would happen. Daniel muttered that I had been under a lot of stress lately. Each lie, each omission painted me darker until I was nothing but the villain of Amanda's masterpiece. When I demanded that they check the security cameras mounted around the house, the officers glanced at each other. Mark shook his head quickly, insisting the system was down, that there had been electrical issues. Amanda clutched her chest, nodding through tears, whispering that she was sorry. But it was true, the cameras had been broken for weeks. I knew then that Mark had pulled the plugs, that they had cut off my one chance at immediate salvation. My body trembled with fury. My voice rose as I cried that they were lying, that this was a trap, but the officers stepped closer, their hands brushing their holsters. They warned me to calm down or risk being restrained. The humiliation seared through me like acid. In front of the family, in front of the neighbors who were now gathering outside the window, I was treated as if I were dangerous, unstable, a criminal in my own skin. Amanda pressed her forehead against Mark's shoulder, sobbing that she did not want to press charges, that she only wanted me to get help. That final dagger painted her as merciful, painted me as a wounded animal. The officers led me toward the door for questioning, their hands firm but not rough, their eyes filled with skepticism. As I stepped out into the cold November night, the laughter of children from nearby houses drifted through the air, mocking the silence of my own destruction. I looked back once to see Daniel still seated, still silent, still refusing to meet my gaze. That silence echoed louder than the accusations. It told me that I was alone, that my marriage was a facade, and that Amanda had succeeded in turning gratitude into betrayal. The ride to the police station was short, but each second pressed against me like a weight I could not push away. The 2 officers sat in silence, except for the occasional crackle of their radio, and I sat in the back seat staring at the blur of holiday lights outside the window, knowing that every glow from every home represented a family gathered in warmth, while mine had just crucified me. At the station, they questioned me, asked me where the gun had come from, asked me why my sister-in-law would make such an accusation if it were not true, and I repeated over and over that I had never touched that gun, that Amanda had orchestrated the whole thing. My words felt like pebbles thrown at a fortress. They kept glancing at their notes at each other, clearly wondering if they should believe the hysterical woman with shaking hands and red eyes, or the composed sister-in-law who had played victim so perfectly. After hours of humiliation, I was released because Amanda declined to press immediate charges, which only reinforced her image of mercy and my image of instability. I walked out into the cold night with the taste of iron in my mouth and a rage so sharp it cut through the fog of despair. Daniel was waiting outside, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his eyes avoiding mine. He muttered that we should go home, that it was late, that talking would only make it worse. I stared at him in disbelief. My husband had watched me accused of a crime I did not commit, had watched me dragged away from Thanksgiving dinner, and he was worried about avoiding more conflict. The betrayal seared hotter than Amanda's lie. At home, the silence grew heavier. Daniel sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, sighing, rubbing his temples, muttering that Amanda must have been scared, that maybe I had looked at her the wrong way, that maybe my stress had frightened her. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand he look at me and remember who I was, but the words curdled in my throat. Instead, I locked myself in the bedroom and stared at the ceiling until the night dissolved into morning. The next few days only grew worse. Amanda told everyone she knew that I had pulled a gun on her, that she had barely escaped with her life. She painted herself as the brave mother who protected her children from the unstable sister-in-law, and the Mitchell family repeated her story like gospel. Mark added details claiming he had seen me reach for the gun, that he had wrestled it away heroically. Gloria called relatives across the country, whispering that she had always known something like this would happen, that Clara had never fit in. Each retelling grew more grotesque, and I became the villain in a saga I had not authored. At the hospital where I worked, I caught colleagues whispering, glancing at me with pity or suspicion. Someone had leaked the story. Patients' families looked at me differently. My reputation, my career, my dignity were unraveling thread by thread. One afternoon, I found Daniel sitting at the kitchen table with his phone on speaker. Amanda's voice floated through the air, smooth and sorrowful, telling him she hoped I was getting help, telling him she wanted to forgive, telling him she did not want to press charges because she cared about family harmony. I ripped the phone from his hand and screamed into it that she was a liar, that she had ruined me, but Amanda only sighed and whispered, "See, she cannot control herself." I hurled the phone against the wall, and Daniel shouted at me for losing control. My heart cracked. The escalation was complete. Amanda had built a narrative so strong that even my husband was willing to see me as unstable rather than face the truth that his family had plotted my destruction. The following weekend, I was summoned to meet with a lawyer hired by Gloria. She sat across from me in a stiff chair, her pearls gleaming, her eyes cold. She said they wanted a restraining order not to punish me but to protect the family. She slid papers across the table. I stared at them, at the black ink that declared me a threat, and something inside me snapped. My hands trembled, but my mind sharpened. I realized they were not simply trying to ruin me socially. They were trying to erase me from the family altogether, to make me a ghost with no voice, no place, no defense. The crime was not just the lie with the gun, it was the conspiracy of silence and manipulation that followed. They had turned their cruelty into a contract, into law, into something that could outlast even my words. I refused to sign, shoving the papers back across the table. Gloria's lips thinned. "This will end badly for you, Clara," she said quietly, as though speaking a prophecy. I met her gaze, my voice shaking but strong. "No, Gloria. It will end badly for you." My pulse thundered. For the first time since that Thanksgiving night, I felt a sliver of power return, a spark of resistance glowing against the darkness they had wrapped around me. I walked out of that office into the winter air, knowing the war had only just begun, but also knowing I would not be the silent victim they expected. They had escalated their cruelty into a crime. Now I would escalate my resistance into survival. The week after Gloria tried to force me into signing those restraining order papers was the lowest point of my life. I felt stripped bare, my dignity trampled, my marriage shattered, my reputation poisoned. I walked through the hospital halls, feeling eyes on me, whispers trailing behind me like smoke. At home, Daniel grew more distant, retreating into silence that burned hotter than shouting ever could. Amanda's story spread further each day, her voice carried through the family network, her lies transforming into accepted history. But fate has a way of planting truth in the cracks, waiting for the right moment to surface. One night after a long shift, I stopped by the small security office of the company that handled surveillance for Gloria's neighborhood. I was not even sure what I hoped to find. I asked if their systems had recorded anything from Thanksgiving, even though Mark had insisted the cameras were broken. The man behind the desk, tired and middle-aged, raised his brow and tapped a few keys. Most of the cameras were offline, he said slowly, but not all. There's one unit in the kitchen that was still recording. No one pulled the plug on that one. My heart pounded so hard I had to grip the counter to steady myself. He turned the monitor toward me, fast-forwarded through hours of silent footage until the screen froze on Amanda. She was alone in the dining room before anyone had gathered, slipping something shiny from her purse. She bent down, opened the drawer of the sideboard, and tucked the object inside. She glanced around once, then smoothed her hair and smiled to herself before walking out to greet the family. My mouth went dry. I knew instantly what I was seeing. Amanda had planted the gun before dinner even began. The proof was right there, time-stamped, clear, undeniable. My breath caught as I whispered, "Can I get a copy of that?" The man shrugged, burned the segment to a USB drive, and handed it to me with a look that said he did not want to get involved. I walked out into the icy night, gripping that drive like a lifeline. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt air in my lungs again. At home, Daniel was sitting on the couch, his phone in hand, Amanda's name still glowing on the screen. I slipped the USB into my pocket, saying nothing. He looked at me as though I were intruding into his solitude. I stared back, thinking of how many times I had begged him to defend me, how many times his silence had cut me deeper than Amanda's words. I knew then he would not be the one I showed the footage to, not yet. This truth was mine, my weapon, and I needed to wield it carefully. That night, I barely slept. I watched the footage over and over, memorizing Amanda's every move, every smug smile. Each viewing fueled me with both fury and strength. I began to plan. I could take it to the police, but I knew Amanda would spin another story, claim it was staged, claim I had tampered with the files. I needed witnesses. I needed a moment so public, so undeniable that her lies would collapse in on themselves. For days, I carried the drive with me everywhere, hidden in my bag, tucked into my pocket during shifts. It became my secret armor, my proof that I was not insane, that the villain they painted me as was nothing more than a character in Amanda's script. The hospital whispers still followed me, but now I straightened my back, my eyes sharper, because I knew a truth they did not. The turning point came when I bumped into Ethan Daniels' younger cousin outside the hospital. He was 25, lanky, with a quiet nature that often made him invisible during family gatherings. He asked gently if I was holding up, his voice awkward but kind. I looked into his eyes and saw something I had not seen in weeks, genuine belief. Without thinking, I asked if he had a moment. I took him to a small coffee shop across the street, slid the USB into my laptop, and pressed play. He leaned forward, his eyes widening as Amanda appeared on screen, planting the gun. When the footage ended, he sat back, stunned. "They lied," he whispered. "They all lied." His voice shook with anger, not surprise. He told me he had always known Amanda was manipulative, that Mark bullied him too, that Gloria looked down on everyone, but he had never realized how far they would go. He clenched his fists and looked at me with a determination I did not expect. "We need to use this," he said firmly. "Not just to clear you, but to end their game for good." For the first time, I felt I was not alone. Ethan leaned across the table in that dim little coffee shop, his eyes lit with a fire I had not seen in anyone since this nightmare began. And in that moment, I realized he was the first person in the Mitchell family to stand on my side. He was younger, only 25, often overlooked at gatherings, treated like the awkward cousin who never quite measured up to Mark's bravado or Amanda's polished perfection, and maybe that invisibility had given him freedom to see what others refused to. He told me he had always felt like an outsider, too, mocked by Mark for not having a high-paying job, dismissed by Gloria as a dreamer, ignored by Daniel, who only ever repeated their mother's words. He said watching me suffer in silence during dinners made him angry, but he had never dared to speak up because he knew how the family could crush anyone who challenged their narrative. Now seeing Amanda caught on camera, he was done being silent. He swore he would help me. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight on my shoulders shift just enough for air to slip through. Together, we began to plan. Ethan suggested that taking the footage straight to the police might not be enough because Amanda would find a way to spin it. He said what we needed was a moment when the family itself could not deny the truth, when every witness who had condemned me would be forced to stare at their own hypocrisy. He proposed waiting for Christmas, the next big gathering when Gloria would host another dinner with relatives from out of town. It would be the perfect stage. At first, I hesitated. The idea of walking back into that house, into that den of wolves, made my skin crawl. But Ethan insisted that public humiliation was the only language Amanda and Gloria understood. He was right. Quiet justice would never break their grip. Public exposure would. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan and I worked in secret. He borrowed equipment from a friend, made duplicate copies of the video so it could not be destroyed, and rehearsed with me how to present it. I had never felt more nervous or more alive. Every day at the hospital, I endured whispers, but at night, I would watch the footage again, reminding myself that truth was mine, that I would deliver it when the moment was right. Daniel grew suspicious of my late nights out, asking if I was seeing someone, but I only shook my head and said I needed space. He looked at me with tired eyes, as though I were a burden he no longer wished to carry. His distance no longer broke me. It steeled me. When Ethan called one evening to confirm that the plan was set, I realized my allegiance had shifted. My husband was no longer my partner. Ethan, the forgotten cousin, was. Christmas night arrived with snow covering the streets in a deceptive blanket of purity. Inside Gloria's house, the atmosphere was thick with carols playing too loudly and relatives sipping wine as though nothing had happened a month earlier. Amanda wore a red dress, her smile blinding her children perched like trophies on either side. Mark stood tall, puffed up with pride, recounting stories about business deals. Gloria floated from guest to guest, her pearls gleaming, her voice dripping with false warmth. Daniel sat slouched in a chair, sipping his drink, silent as ever. I entered with Ethan by my side, my pulse hammering the USB drive tucked safely into his pocket. Gloria's eyes narrowed instantly. Amanda's smile faltered for a split second before she plastered it back on. Mark muttered under his breath, "She has some nerve showing up." We endured the meal, the small talk, the forced laughter, my stomach twisting with every bite. Then Ethan caught my eye, gave a small nod, and slipped away to connect his laptop to the television in the living room. When the plates were cleared and Gloria clinked her glass to begin a toast, the screen behind her flickered to life. The room quieted, forks paused mid-air as Amanda's face filled the screen. The footage played silent but damning, showing her pulling the gun from her purse, slipping it into the drawer, glancing around with a satisfied smirk. Gasps erupted. Gloria's face went pale. Mark's jaw dropped. Daniel finally lifted his head. Amanda froze, her wine glass trembling in her hand. Ethan's voice rang clear. "This is the truth you all chose to ignore." The room erupted into chaos. Relatives whispered. Children stared. Amanda sputtered excuses. Gloria demanded the video be turned off, but it was too late. They had all seen it. The lie that had nearly destroyed me was now unraveling in front of every witness who had once condemned me. And for the first time, I felt the tide shift in my favor. The living room erupted into a storm the second the video ended, the glow of the television throwing sharp light across faces twisted with shock and disbelief. For a moment, no one moved, the silence heavy and suffocating. Then whispers broke out like cracks in glass. "She planted it. It was her all along. I can't believe this." Amanda stood frozen, her red dress clinging to her, as if it too was caught in her trap, the wine glass slipping from her hand and shattering against the hardwood floor. "That's fake!" she screeched, her voice high and desperate, but her eyes darted wildly, betraying her panic. Gloria lurched forward, her pearls rattling as she demanded the video be turned off, her voice sharp enough to slice the air. "This is slander. You cannot bring lies into my home on Christmas." But Ethan stepped in front of the television, his lanky frame surprisingly steady, his voice firm in a way that silenced even Gloria. "It's not slander. It's the truth. We made multiple copies stored safely. Even if you destroy this, the evidence remains. Everyone here has seen it." The relatives murmured, louder heads turning toward Amanda, eyes narrowing with disgust, with betrayal. Mark surged to his feet, his face crimson, his fists clenched. "You don't understand. She was scared. She thought Clara was dangerous," he shouted, but the video still replayed in their minds, the smirk on Amanda's face as she hid the gun. That smirk was undeniable. I stepped forward, then my legs trembling but my spine straight. For weeks, I had carried shame like chains, but now the weight shifted onto Amanda. You framed me in front of everyone, I said, my voice trembling but rising stronger with each word. You lied to the police. You poisoned my reputation. You nearly destroyed my marriage, and every one of you believed her. My gaze swept the room, landing on Gloria, on Mark, finally on Daniel. You all chose her performance over my truth. Amanda's eyes blazed as she lunged toward me, her hands shaking. You don't belong here, she spat. You never did. I had to protect this family. Her words rang hollow brittle because the image of her crime was still fresh in everyone's minds. Ethan stepped between us, blocking her path. Protect the family, he demanded, by planting a gun and crying wolf, by trying to have Clara arrested. Amanda's children began to cry, their small voices piercing through the chaos. Relatives hurried them into another room, muttering about shame, about disgrace. Gloria's face twisted, her authority crumbling in front of her guests. Enough, she snapped, her voice shaking. Clara, you should have kept this private. Family matters do not belong in public spectacles. I laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. Private. You dragged me in front of the police. You let your daughter in, law smear my name at work in the neighborhood to anyone who would listen. You wanted me erased quietly, but now the truth is loud and you cannot silence it. Mark pounded the table, his voice booming. You are tearing this family apart. My chest burned with fury as I shot back. No, Amanda tore it apart the moment she chose deceit over decency. You and Gloria fueled it by believing her lies. Daniel allowed it by sitting in silence. All eyes turned to Daniel then. He sat rigid in his chair, his drink forgotten, his face pale. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally whispered, I thought it was easier to believe them than to fight them. The room hushed. His words were an admission not of guilt in Amanda's crime, but of cowardice. My heart clenched, not with love, but with finality. And that I said softly is why you are no longer my husband. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Gloria clutched her chest. Mark muttered curses. Amanda shrieked that I was ungrateful. But I felt clarity wash over me, sharp and clean. Ethan raised the volume on the television, replaying Amanda's act again. Each frame was a nail in her coffin, each second a strip of her false image peeling away. One of Gloria's cousins, a stern woman with a voice that cut through the noise, finally spoke. This is unforgivable. You framed an innocent woman. You lied to us all. Others nodded, murmurs of agreement swelling like a tide. Amanda's power collapsed with every whisper. She sank into her chair, her face streaked with tears that no longer inspired sympathy. Gloria tried to defend her, but her words faltered, her reputation unraveling alongside Amanda's. The final blow came when Ethan pulled out his phone and announced that the footage had already been sent to the police, to lawyers, to trusted contacts. If you try to bury this, he said, it will only dig deeper. Amanda screamed that he was betraying family, but Ethan only looked at her with disgust. Family does not mean protecting liars who destroy lives. The room erupted again, voices colliding, accusations flung, relatives leaving in disgust. I stood in the center, my body trembling, my breath shallow, but for the first time I felt tall, felt seen. Amanda had framed me with a gun at Thanksgiving. Now on Christmas, her lies were caught on camera, her mask shattered, her allies scattered. The confrontation had stripped everyone bare. Daniel's cowardice, Gloria's control, Mark's arrogance, Amanda's deceit. And in the wreckage of their downfall, I stood no longer silent, no longer erased, but the one voice that had survived their storm. The fallout began immediately after Christmas night and spread like wildfire through the Mitchell family's social circle. Amanda could not hide behind her charm anymore, not when everyone had seen her plant the gun with their own eyes. Within days, the police contacted her for questioning, and though she tried to spin another story about stress and misunderstanding, the footage was too precise, too damning. The smirk on her face in that recording was impossible to explain away. She was charged with filing a false police report and obstruction, and while she avoided jail time initially, the stain of a criminal case clung to her like smoke. Her friends stopped calling the other mothers at her children's school, whispered behind her back, and her once pristine reputation crumbled. Mark, who had shouted the loudest about my supposed guilt, found himself mocked by co-workers when the truth spread. His pride, his authority, all collapsed under the weight of humiliation. He had sworn he saw me lunge for a gun, yet the footage showed his wife alone rehearsed guilty. The ridicule followed him into his workplace, his colleagues joking about his hero act, his boss questioning his judgment. He grew angrier, bitter, snapping at anyone who mentioned Amanda, but his anger only deepened his isolation. Gloria, who had worn control like a crown, could no longer command respect. Relatives who once listened to her every word now avoided her calls. At church, where she had strutted with pearls and pride, whispers grew louder until even she could hear them. The woman who had declared me unstable now faced pitying looks as if she had lost her touch, as if her control had finally slipped. She tried to salvage her image by claiming she had been deceived too, but her endless insistence that she had always known I was trouble now rang hollow. Her empire of authority collapsed under its own hypocrisy. And Daniel, my husband, bore his own punishment, though softer than the others, yet just as devastating. He had not lied outright, but his silence had been a betrayal carved into stone. After the Christmas exposure, he looked at me with hollow eyes, begging for another chance, saying he had been afraid that he had wanted to keep the peace. But peace built on silence was not love. His relatives saw him differently too. They whispered that he had failed to protect his wife, failed to stand for truth, failed to be a man. He carried shame in his slouched shoulders in the way he avoided everyone's gaze. I filed for divorce within a week. He did not fight it. The Mitchell family, once united against me, turned against each other. Amanda blamed Mark for not covering her better. Mark blamed Gloria for encouraging the scheme. Gloria blamed Daniel for marrying me in the first place, and Daniel blamed everyone for his ruined marriage. Their alliances fractured, their dinners turned bitter, their reputation in the community soured. Neighbors shook their heads, acquaintances pulled away. The empire of lies they had built collapsed in plain view, brick by brick, under the weight of undeniable truth. For me, the consequence was freedom. For them, it was shame, public and private, lasting and inescapable. When the papers were signed and the last trace of my marriage dissolved, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and relief, like shedding a heavy coat that had once kept me warm but now suffocated me. I moved into a modest apartment near the hospital, its bare walls echoing with silence that for the first time in years felt peaceful instead of hostile. The first night I slept there, the quiet pressed against my ears, but rather than dread it, I embraced it. No Gloria calling at dawn to criticize my life choices, no. Amanda smirking across a dinner table, no Daniel sinking into silence, while betrayal festered around us. Just me, the hum of the radiator and a sense of space that belonged entirely to myself. At the hospital, colleagues approached hesitantly, some offering apologies for believing gossip, others quietly nodding as if to acknowledge they had seen the news unravel Amanda's lies. I accepted their words, but did not linger on them. I had spent too long trying to prove myself to others. Now, I wanted only to prove to myself that I could rebuild. I took extra shifts, not out of desperation, but choice, throwing myself into work that mattered, work that saved lives rather than destroyed them. The whispers faded as the truth took root, and my reputation, once tarnished, began to shine brighter for having endured trial by fire. Ethan visited often, bringing coffee after long shifts, helping me move furniture, sitting across from me as we planned small steps toward healing. He never pushed, never asked for more than I could give, simply reminded me that not all family was toxic, that some bonds were chosen, not forced. His presence was a reminder that allies could be found in unexpected places, that silence did not always mean betrayal. Sometimes it meant listening. One weekend, I took a train north to Vermont, renting a small cabin by a frozen lake. The wood creaked beneath my feet, the air smelled of pine and snow, and I sat by the window with a journal open on my lap, writing words that flowed like a river finally freed from a dam. I wrote about the gun, about Amanda's smirk, about Gloria's sneer, about Daniel's silence. I wrote until the pages were filled, until the ink bled like wounds closing into scars. I walked by the lake at dawn, the air so crisp it burned my lungs, and for the first time in years, I did not feel watched, judged, or diminished. I felt alive. Memories still came painful and sharp, but they no longer controlled me. When Amanda's name appeared in headlines about her court hearings, I did not flinch. When Daniel sent one last message begging to talk, I did not reply. When Gloria's old friends whispered about her downfall, I did not smile in satisfaction, though part of me wanted to. I simply let it be. Their consequences were theirs to bear. Mine was freedom. Sitting by that lake, I realized the best revenge had never been proving them wrong or watching them fall. The best revenge was creating a life where their shadows no longer touched me. I had survived the gun, the lies, the silence, the betrayal, and I had emerged not broken, but stronger. My story was no longer about being framed or being silenced. It was about reclaiming my voice, my dignity, my peace. As snowflakes drifted across the water and the world hushed into winter stillness, I closed my journal and whispered to myself, "You are free." And for the first time in far too long, I believed it.